And now we'll have the second conference chair, Dr. Randall Burgo, CEO of Australian Digital Transformation Agency, representing Dr. Michael Keenan, Minister for Human Services and Digital Transformation of Australia. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. Great to be here and welcome to the 2019 ICEGOV conference. As many of you may know, today is post-budget day. Last night the Australian budget was handed down and we're at the period at which the Australian community is watching in relation to the announcement of an upcoming election. What I'm going to talk to you today about today does not relate to any of that. I'm going to talk to you about a few things which I'll go through in a moment. Before I do that though, I wanted to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. And I'd also like to pay my respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who may be here with us today. Also like to acknowledge our international and domestic counterparts. Thank you, Luis, Chris, Elsa, for the opening comments and for the organisers for bringing us to such a wonderful venue. I'll talk about four things today. First will be a bit about Australia, two, the Australian government, three, our digital transformation journey, and four, what you'll see up on the screen as the title, the life events approach and how this is helping us better understand the people and businesses that we serve. And the themes of the conference, equality, inclusiveness and productivity, are at the centre of what we're doing as well. We'll also have time at the end for questions, and I'm looking forward to taking those questions when we come to that point. But first, I wanted to share a story. Caring for a loved one, Cleo is a carer. She looks after her son Anthony, who has autism. Anthony recently turned 18, but before he did, Cleo started to prepare for his transition into adulthood from a government service perspective. When a child turns 18 in Australia, in the eyes of the government, they become responsible for themselves. They're able to vote, they can buy alcohol, and they can make decisions that impact their own lives. This transition can be straightforward for many and a cause for celebration, but it isn't so straightforward for children who require care after that transition, nor is it straightforward for their carers. So after many frustrating interactions, Cleo put pen to paper or her fingers to the keyboard and she wrote a letter. This expressed her frustrations and concerns in managing that transition for her son. Cleo's letter made its way to me. A typical government response can sometimes be, here is the standard blurb when it comes to how you go about helping to manage the transition, and links to a variety of websites and FAQs that might help you through that process. Or sometimes we don't respond at all. But we responded differently. We took a human-centred approach to the problem. We asked Cleo if it was okay if we came and spoke with her. And when Cleo came back and said, yes, I'm more than happy to have a chat to you, we put two people on a plane and they went down to visit her. Their key objective was to understand Cleo and Anthony's story, or their life event journey. And this is how government is hoping to change. Cleo spoke about her experiences as Anthony became an adult, and what was required as his circumstances changed. For those who aren't aware, from the age of about 14 to 18 is the transitional period for those who require care and support. And so Cleo had been working through this process for 4 years. She told us that she needed to speak to multiple government agencies and let many organisations, both public and private sector, know that she needed to act on Anthony's behalf. She provided information over and over again, and as part of this process, she had to prove who her son was. He had no existing photographic ID. He wasn't eligible for a driver's licence. He didn't meet the criteria for a passport because they couldn't satisfy the requirement for the passport photograph. And so, as you'll see, as the quote on the screen, how can they say he doesn't exist? He's been here in the system for 16 years. It's remarkable. And so, on a bad day, Cleo would turn up with Andrew in an office where they needed to present in person, and given the noisy environment, they would actually need to go home and try again the next day. All in all, they had about 10 different interactions to prove who Anthony was. She also had to go, as I'd mentioned, to private sector organisations to ensure that they understood that she was going to act on his behalf as he became an adult. I could go on, but I won't. What should be clear is that what Cleo went through with Anthony is not okay. I mean, we need to do better. From our research, we know that many people, such as Cleo, struggle to deal with these end-to-end experiences. They struggle to find the right information at the right time, particularly where the life event is unexpected or stressful. We also know that people are unsure about what entitlements they may be eligible for, their obligations in interacting with government, and the services that they need to deal with are often complex and hard to understand. Information spread across multiple agencies and multiple layers of government, and sometimes is inconsistent or contradictory. And people are often left very confused, frustrated or unsure about what to do next. Now, the good news is Cleo navigated her way through it, and Anthony was successfully transitioned to a point where she was able to continue to provide care for him. But it was much more difficult than what it needs to be. I'll come back to that in a moment. Australian context, 2/3 of the conference comes from outside Australia, so I thought I'd do the quick TripAdvisor whip through of what Australia is about. It's a highly diverse country. About half of all of Australians were either born overseas or had their parent born overseas. We speak about 300 languages. Australia, from an area perspective, is very large and highly urbanised. Our population density, though, is around 3.3 people per square kilometre, versus a place such as Singapore, which has 7,916 people per square kilometre. And more than 90% of Australians live within 100 kilometres of the coast. To put Australia's size in perspective, our biggest electoral division, Durack, in Western Australia, if that was a country, it would be the 19th largest on earth, and that electorate is bigger than France, Germany and Spain combined. With this in mind, it's not surprising that Australians are very connected. 89% of Australians own and use a smartphone. 88% of Australians are active internet users. And on the slightly scarier side, and it is widely reported that there are plenty of things in Australia that can kill you, Australia has 21 of the 25 most dangerous snakes in the world. But on to the DTA, and I'll provide a quick run through of the Australian Government and the Digital Transformation Agency, given that about 3/4 of the audience is not from government. So the Digital Transformation Agency is a federal government agency. Australia is a federation, 3 layers of government. The federal government, the state and territory government and local government. It's not unusual to have layers of government, and I know many other countries in the world have exactly the same thing. In our federal government, we have 186 agencies and over 155,000 public servants. And that set of organisations and people deliver services ranging from defence to social security, infrastructure, education, health policy and so on. The DTA is very small. We are 300 people, 200 of which are permanent and about 100 temporary. We are very diverse in that we have a range of internal and external staff, a range of skill sets, policy experts, technologists, data scientists, digital product managers and so on. And I'm proud to say that 56% of our workforce is female. DTO was the first, or the Digital Transformation Office was the first instantiation of what is currently the DTA, and that was formed back in January 2015. So a very new organisation in the scheme of things, and our purpose has changed over those few years of existence. And I'll read our purpose now. Our purpose is to accelerate digital transformation by encouraging coordinated investment in digital services, helping to transform the experience of people and businesses dealing with government, and improving the return on ICT and digital investment. We have 4 priorities for this financial year, which is between the 1st of July 2018 and the 30th of June 2019. Priority 1 is deliver a digital transformation strategy and roadmap out to 2025. You can find this on the DTA website. It was published in November of last year. We deliver whole of government platforms, including a digital identity program for the nation. We provide investment advice and assurance for major ICT and digital investments in the Australian government, and we have a program of digital capability improvement which is focused on skills and how we source capability from the market. On the digital transformation strategy, we have an aspiration to be in the top 3 countries in the world when it comes to e-government. And it's been widely reported in the lead up to our digital transformation strategy release that Australia ranks 2nd in the UN-EGOV Index, and that's for the 3rd year in a row. So Australia is doing okay when it comes to how it delivers digital services to people and businesses around the country. Now, the assessment that the UN undertakes looks at online services, which looks at national websites, telecommunications infrastructure, so that's internet, fixed, mobile and broadband services, and human capital, which looks at adult literacy, years of schooling and so on. But even though Australia is in the top e-governments globally, we can't afford to stand still. We're living, as you would well know, in a rapidly changing world. Our reliance on digital is increasing day by day. And people and businesses expect more of government just as they do from private sector organisations. So our digital transformation strategy provides that vision to meet the needs of people and businesses into the future. 3 core priorities. I won't go into the detail of each, but it is focused on 3 elements. 1, government that's easy to deal with. 2, government that's informed by you. And 3, government that's fit for the digital age. And thinking about those at their core, priority 1 is about providing services that satisfy the needs of people and businesses. The second is focused on data and insights, making the best use of data that the Australian government can, considering consent, social licence and so on. And then being fit for the digital age is about skills and capability that takes us forward. To make government easier to deal with, we need to ensure that we reduce friction in the interactions, and the Cleo and Anthony story is an example of a set of interactions that have high friction. And as we're moving through these complex life event journeys, we are discovering that people are confused, and it is much more difficult for people to interact with government than it should be. We're okay at routine activities, so people can complete a tax return or renew a passport very, very easily. My daughter did her tax return last financial year using her smartphone, and it took her a matter of minutes, given the fact that the digital capability was so good. But in order for us to string together those more complex series of interactions, we take what we call a life event journey approach. To illustrate, I'll share another story. In our research, we spoke with a person who we'll call Andrew, whose wife Jane passed away unexpectedly. At the same time as Andrew was dealing with the loss of his wife, he also had to deal with the masses of administration. He had to make funeral arrangements quite clearly, but he had to deal with their joint finances, their mortgage, which were in both names, manage Jane's will, and so on. He also needed to organise to get Jane's death certificate, which came from a state and territory rather than the Commonwealth. And then he had to provide it to almost every government agency he dealt with, as well as several private sector organisations to prove that his wife had passed away. In the end, Andrew had to deal with 34 organisations on his wife's death. The DTA is working on addressing the pain points or points of friction in that end-to-end user journey. And we're working with a collection of agencies to deal with some of those right now. We've recently released a Tell Us Once platform for testing that allows people to provide information once, and with their consent, that will be shared and actioned with the agencies and organisations that people ask them to share. So the current experience in government, as I'm sure you'd appreciate, there are complexities and legacies associated with the way government delivers services, and it's not unique to government. This also exists in the private sector. We are just a mega organism that needs to move with the times and deal with some of the legacy structures that were designed with the best intentions in mind at that point in time. We need to think about how we can insulate people and businesses from the structures that exist in government and provide a more integrated service. That also, though, requires us to think about how we fund, develop and operate services at a whole of government perspective, and how we collaborate more effectively both within government but also with the private sector. And this also includes, in Australia at least, working with our state and territory governments as well as the third parties. But it's hard, and we're constantly asking ourselves how we can have the biggest impact when it comes to that experience. And life events is where we're starting when it comes to understanding and addressing these problems. So what is a life events approach? Sometimes people and businesses have a single transaction that they undertake with government, and things like checking the weather, applying for a fishing licence can be quite a simple experience, but there are many occasions where these experiences are more complex. So a life event journey is a set of activities that people or businesses undertake to get something done. Life event journeys are made up of a number of interactions across different levels of government, as well as interactions with the private sector, as I'd mentioned. This is a simple extract of some of the things that we would consider when we're looking at having a baby life event to illustrate. So when people have a baby, I'll talk a bit more about this in a moment. They need to seek everything from organising prenatal classes through to community health nursing and government income support. But by looking at the experience from the life event level, we're able to see how people interact with both government and private sector services and products. And difficult interactions or pain points are caused by issues in accessing individual services. But often pain points relate to the cumulative experience that people have. So an example might be people need to provide information multiple times. They say, well, actually, I've provided my name, address and date of birth to agency X. Why am I providing my name, address and date of birth to agency Y? Or receiving confusing or conflicting information, as I'd mentioned earlier. So how we do it? I mean, the first thing I think to remember is that we are all personas. We are all people who interact with government personally. And I had a discussion recently with the board of the Australian Digital Health Agency. I talked about a personal experience that I had in dealing with the Australian medical system. I'm a persona. yes, I'm involved in helping to lead Australia's government response to how we provide simple, clear and fast services, but I'm also a person who interacts with government. We all are. And so I think there are some practical things that we can all do to help drive forward this agenda. But at a technical level, the DTA starts by doing user research. This is the first criteria in our digital service standard, which again you can find on the DTA website, which is to understand user needs. This research is being done in the context of broader needs, so we don't just look at, for example, income support payments. We look at the experience people have when they're unemployed or looking for work. Based on this research, we map the end-to-end experience, and we look at how government provides services and how the underlying capabilities, technology, data, policy and legislation support that. And this gives us a system-based view of that life event. We highlight the critical pain points that people have along the journey, and we start identifying opportunities to fix them. But the key point here is understanding that life event, not thinking in terms of the way government is organised, and delivering incremental value against that strategic end state. This lets us kind of break through the complexity, and looking across multiple life events, we can start to see common pain points and opportunities, and that's where some of the bigger opportunities can exist. So based on our research, here are 10 of the common pain points that we've had in all of our research with people who interact with government. These are issues that we know impact people almost universally, no matter what government services they're accessing. As you can see, people find it difficult to find the information at the right time, in the right context, lack of clear pathways to deliver outcomes. These are the kinds of things that I've talked about in specific life event journeys in the examples that we've spoken about. So why is it useful? It's not the only way of us understanding how we provide better services. It is one lens through which we look. But it provides the opportunity to understand people's real experiences and be able to tailor services in a way that satisfies their most important needs. It allows us to see problems that span multiple services, and it lets us consider system-wide solutions to these pain points. And finally, possibly the most important, the life events approach lets us cut through complexity and prioritise improvements to meet people's needs. We're not alone. Great work is happening around the globe, and in your countries, I suspect that there is work being done in relation to life event journeys, and we're learning from other countries who may be more advanced in this area than Australia. We've got an image up there of New Zealand government's Smart Start service. This provides step-by-step information and support to help people access the right services for themselves and others in one place. In the first year of operation, the New Zealand Smart Start had more than 170,000 users, which indicates that it's offering value. Gov.uk organises content based on life events. If you want to learn to drive a car, as my daughters did about a year ago, and it was terrifying, you can have the common steps that you need to go through to be able to actually learn how to drive a car. Private sector organisations also are pushing the boundaries and leading in many, many areas, and I'm sure that in your interactions with, your bank or your insurance company, you're seeing very much personalised and linked up services that are based on life events, whether you know it or not. So what needs to change? And we have some absolutely tiny diagrams there which just are illustrative of the journey maps that we create. But in order for us to leverage this, we need to fundamentally change the way we think and work in government. This isn't about design and technology specifically. This is about the way we think about providing services and understanding the people and businesses that interact with us. It's allowing us to create this mental model that's based on the user being at the centre of everything that we do, not the structure of government or individual agencies or services. The DTA is also helping agencies to connect and provide support where they're embarking upon this journey for the first time. But ultimately, we're helping government get better at understanding what people need and working together to deliver that. And we're also better connecting between the Commonwealth and the states and territories. A forum called the Australian Digital Council was formed late last year, and that has all ministers responsible for data and digital across the country, and working together, we're identifying what are very common challenges, and the more we speak with our jurisdictions, the more we understand that they share common problems, but invariably they contribute to the end-to-end journey in some way, shape or form. We also have life event communities. At the moment we have 5 life event communities that we support: having a baby, accessing childcare, looking for work, caring for a loved one and end of life. We have more than 350 people across all levels of government. Our most recent community meetup had over 150 people from 40 local, state and federal agencies participating, and our plan in the future is to build more of these communities. And so I'll end on a final story, then happy to take questions. So I spoke about having a baby, and this is a classic life event. Our eldest daughter is 21. When she was born, we were handed the paper form and we diligently filled that in, and that allowed us to register her birth, and then we interacted with a range of agencies to complete all of the administration required following her birth. Now, today, based on our research, there are only 2 pieces of information that we don't already hold, either in government or non-government systems. That's the name of the baby and the details of the father. Everything else we have. But we still ask all of those questions over and over again based on the services that people need to register for. So we've been trying to kind of crack this complexity and the experience that people have in both their personal environment, and it can be challenging having a new baby or leading up to the birth, and the administrative complexity. And so we spoke with George and his wife Isabel, who welcomed their first child into the world 9 months ago. Getting pregnant was a protracted experience. It was 4.5 years of IVF, to the point where Isabel fell pregnant, and they were clearly very anxious about the whole pregnancy process, as you can see on the slide. But in George's words, and he said, we are worrying about what every kick means. And there are a million different things going through their mind. In addition to the stresses of the pregnancy, they needed to think about antenatal care, birthing classes, arranging parental leave, finding the right medical providers, actually having the baby, getting the birth certificate, enrolling in Medicare, and post-birth health activities. These are almost exclusively discrete services. And in many cases, they span both Commonwealth, state and territory, and private sector interactions. Technology was also a barrier for them in that we weren't interoperating between organisations, and as a consequence, the paperwork and complexity was so great that George said, I give up, I'm going to talk to somebody. So he presented at a government shop front, and he had a very helpful woman who had worked there for a while that stepped him through the process. She said, you know, this is where you go, this is what they'll ask you, and this is what the question means. And so it's great that George and Isabel were able to navigate that and had somebody so helpful, but what would be much more helpful is if we're able to make that digital process accessible and integrated. So understanding that life event journey is informing the work that we're doing with the ACT government as part of the Australian Digital Council work, who are working on a proof of concept trial to make the process of registering a birth, enrolling a baby in public health systems and so on much easier for people like George and Isabel. And so in the future with consent, we plan to provide an integrated end-to-end experience that covers all of the different discrete services in a joined-up way. And what this will do ultimately is let people spend less time in dealing with government and more time doing the things that really matter to them. Thank you, and happy to take questions.
Thank you. Mark Toomey from the Digital Leadership Institute. Randall, could you comment for us, please, on your comparative view of how the federal government is tackling digital transformation and the New South Wales government, particularly in the light of the announcement just in the last few days of the appointment of a Minister for Service Delivery?
So we've been working very closely with the New South Wales government on digital transformation. Damon Rees from Service New South Wales and Greg Wells, who has a new role given the post-election period, they are leading in a whole range of areas, particularly when it comes to providing digital options for their constituents. And so we're working with them in relation to an interjurisdictional forum at the technology level with CIOs that come together to share experiences. And we're also working with them closely on the Australian Digital Council, and New South Wales is leading in a whole range of areas. Digital identity is a really interesting area where New South Wales has done some great work, and they have millions of digital identities that they have issued that are providing seamless access into the services at that state government level. And so from the point of view of the strategy and the technology delivery, we're working closely with them. They're learning from us and we're learning from them. And what you'll see in relation to our digital transformation strategy, those three core priorities are not dissimilar to what New South Wales has in their digital transformation strategy. To the question about the scope of the role in relation to the Minister, that has become much broader, and in New South Wales the scope of that role provides the capacity for them to exert influence and deliver integrated services without needing to seek permission or seek support from other organisations. It takes a friction point out of the process. From the point of view of the federal government, we're working within the settings that we have, and through collaboration, I think we're delivering some really great outcomes, but there is still more of a negotiation happening at the federal government level than what there will be, I expect, at the New South Wales government level. Does that answer the question? Okay.
So, good morning, everyone. Randall, I want to ask you a simple question. So, what is your personal opinion, and then the agency you are a part of opinion, about using blockchain-based technology to provide service like property registration or the newborn's registration and any other service to people and business?
Thank you, and it is a question that we are often asked. Again, referring to the DTA website, we have provided a summary of our current position on blockchain. Now, we conducted a trial on blockchain late last year that looked at its utility in providing support for government services. And our position ended up being, and we provided this in this evidence in a recent Senate estimates hearing, is that we need to maintain a watching brief on blockchain as it develops, but for almost every use case that we would contemplate, we consider that there is a more suitable technology option that you would use in the short term.
My question relates to measurement. How does DTA is currently measuring the impact of digital transformation in society and in the economy? Do you have comparable data and statistics to measure those impacts?
So what we have in our digital transformation strategy is a set of priorities, a set of objectives and a set of measures. And so I won't step through the detail of the measures, but you can find those on our website. But they set the macro measures when it comes to understanding the performance of digital transformation in Australia. So if you think about, and I'll think about the first one, where we're talking about government that is easy to deal with. The objective is to get to a point where all government services are available digitally, and that's something that we can very easily measure. The quality of those services, though, is where the complexity will come. It's all well and good to say, actually, we provide this in a digital form such that you can complete a PDF that then is routed to a processing officer who, in back office, processes it exactly as they do today. So there are grades of achievement of those objectives that are being worked through right now as we're building the roadmap. And associated with the digital transformation strategy, and I didn't mention it in the presentation, although it is published, is a roadmap of 77 initiatives that look forward in the next 18 to 24 months, which are commitments that have been made to progress the digital transformation agenda in Australia. And each of those individually can be measured to determine their relative success and their alignment with the digital transformation priorities.
I think there is a person in the front.
Good morning, Dr. Randall. I would like to thank you for a very comprehensive presentation. And my questions relate to two of your slides, one on pain points and the other one on global practices. And let me give you a little bit of background before I raise my question. I mean, I come from India, and I've been working on the Digital India program for the past 7 years. Now, India has a number of states like Australia, and the processes that are being transformed for digital transformation, there are two types. One which are of national interest, like the income tax or the passport. These are national programs. And then there are state-centric programs like driving license, land records, etc. Now, the question for you is, how do we ensure that the processes which are getting transformed at the state level, the best practices are adopted by the other states? That if a particular state has done well, I mean, it should not happen that each state is reinventing the wheel. And how do you make sure in Australia that the states, I mean, they don't go off on their own tangents and start doing their own thing for state-centric processes?
I think the simple answer is that we can't stop the states and territories working on their own agendas and priorities. But I mentioned the Australian Digital Council, and if nothing else, what the Australian Digital Council has been able to achieve is transparency. We actually know what the states and territories are working on, and we have an incredible amount of goodwill when it comes to collaboration and sharing of intellectual property across the states and territories and the Commonwealth, and also being able to assign leads for different elements of the enabling capabilities. So I mentioned, for example, the ACT leading the work on having a baby, that life event journey. But we have a range of other initiatives in relation to looking for work, but also technical capabilities such as data integration standards that are being coordinated with visibility nationally, but acknowledging that each individual state and territory is going to have its own political line of responsibility and policy, its own funding, and what we're doing as step one is transparency, and then trying to move away from what the unitary service might be at a state and territory level, or a unitary service might be at the Commonwealth level, and stringing those together to demonstrate what a person or a business actually needs to do. And we've had wonderful support from the states and territories to that as a concept. So I mentioned what needs to change, and a lot of this is cultural. It's about the way we think and defaulting to what is the problem we're trying to solve, rather than starting with, so what are the technical building blocks and how can we think about streamlining or digitising those? So I think we're making good progress, but I really don't think we're ever going to get to a point in the current political model within Australia where we will see direction at the Commonwealth level that mandates compliance at the state and territory level, other than when we look at some of the national requirements in relation to cyber security, when it comes to other standards which might, for example, have sovereignty built in.
There was a lady in this row. I wonder if you still want, yeah? Okay, yes.
Thank you so much. From South Africa, but it might link to the question from the gentleman in India, that to what extent are you or will you be able to more closely align with international governments in their own projects if they fail to implement something like your live events program?
So we're working very closely with a number of countries, and our intention is to learn from that experience and pick the best bits. And so if we think about work that's been done in relation to national identity, countries such as Uruguay, Estonia have a national digital identity program that assigns a number at birth. Now, the way they use their digital identity is very interesting from our perspective, but we need to adjust that in the Australian context to ensure that we create an identity ecosystem that is not a government-issued number, but an identity which is owned by individuals in Australia, and then they have the choice as to whether they want to take that up or not. So what we're finding is that there are experiences that our international counterparts have had that have either resulted in a failure or a success that we're learning from. So a failure is just as interesting to us as a success, and we're building our programs around that international experience. And when we look at, so for example, I spoke yesterday to one of the people who built the Digital Academy in the UK at the Government Digital Service, because we're contemplating creating a digital academy of our own within Australia to build digital talent and promote that. But they have had recent experience which has demonstrated challenges, and we're going to be able to avoid that mistake. And likewise, we're connecting in with a range of other countries when it comes to talent management, training and development, and the life event journey approach is something that was done in the UK, for example, among other countries. So we're drawing the best that we can from international experience. We're as interested about the failures as we are the successes, and then we're customising each of the capabilities that we provide to the Australian context.
Thank you. So a lot of arms raised. Yeah, I think you can start in the end. And we'll have to close the session after these 4 next questions, okay?
Yeah, good morning. I'm DC Mishra from India, Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. I just wanted to know, many of us consider Australian e-governance as a success story, and it is. Truly, a lot of work has been done. But my question deals with the data and metadata standards. What percentage of the attribute are interoperable among all Australian e-governance systems? What percentage of location ID, individual ID, what are the items which are common across all e-governance systems in Australia, ensuring data interoperability? Thank you.
If I was in a Senate estimates hearing, that would be a response of, I'll take that on notice, Senator. I really don't know the answer to that question. I don't know what proportion of our data is interoperable. What I do know is that we are increasingly bringing together information in a way that preserves privacy and maintains that consent-based environment where we're getting a more integrated view of the way people interact with government. We have, and I see Gemma in the audience from my previous time at the Bureau of Statistics, and Gemma was leading this particular piece of work. We have this program of work called the Data Integration Partnership for Australia that is a program which looks to bring together information that we know about people, about businesses and about locations. And that is done in a way, as I said, that preserves privacy but is assisting incredibly when it comes to policy design. So understanding people's journeys through life, bringing together census data. So we have what's called the Australian Census Longitudinal data set that brings together a number of iterations of our census. There is fascinating information. I'd encourage you all to have a look at the ABS data products, because thinking about that story of that person who was in grade 12 and studied this particular area of specialisation that then moved into university, that is then in the workforce, understanding that journey to say, well, here is where people are adjusting to the future of work and their relative success in doing that, through to bringing health data together with other information that we know about people's location and salary and so on, to determine, well, how well are we servicing the needs of people at different socioeconomic status points in different geographies with the medical needs that they might have. So we're doing better, but I couldn't tell you to what degree we're interoperable. So a long non-answer.
Thank you very much. There was a question in this side of the room, and yes, please. And then we'll end with another one.
Thank you. I have a question regarding institutional reform. I think that it makes a lot of sense to think in terms of life events, and once you start trying to implement those changes, you realize you need a certain degree of standardization of data, which is one of the things that was already mentioned. But even more at the more administrative level, you realize there's each agency has its own things that they're supposed to be doing according to the laws and regulations, and sometimes those things are on the way of implementing changes. So my question is, how is Australia dealing with that reality, and how is it possible to streamline all these changes in such a short amount of time?
So great question, and it is a structural and very strategic discussion that we're having within the public service when we think about how do we resource capabilities that span layers of government, or even within a layer of government. So if we think about, say, our digital identity capability that is being piloted right now in Australia, how we resource that in a way that ensures that we can build a national capability and it is funded as a national capability is something that we're kind of piecing together within the current structures. And so in the case of identity, we have the Digital Transformation Agency is leading the work, with the Australian Taxation Office building the MyGov ID, with the Department of Human Services building the Exchange, with the Department of Home Affairs building the assurance services for proofing, so facial verification service and document verification service, and Department of Foreign Affairs providing inputs from the passports system, and the relying services contributing, be they through tax file numbers, grants and so on. But that's being funded as a whole of government initiative, but the funding is distributed to each individual agency. As we scale this up and we think beyond an individual elementary enabling service, and we think about a life event journey, how do we create a resource base that allows us to build a life event journey for dealing with death? Structurally, in government, the way the budget process, operational rules work, it doesn't support, one, these whole of government capabilities as well as it could, but it also doesn't support this incremental approach as well as it should either, because our budget models, as many countries have, are based on, you have an idea as to what the problem is that you need to solve, you do a whole bunch of research, you come up with the design, you have that costed, you then seek budget approval, and then 2 or 3 years later, at best, you start a program that needs to deliver on a design that was done 3 or 4 years earlier to completion. Where what we're saying is we need to do this in increments, we need to have funding that's provided in tranches, and we need to think about how we invest in whole of government capability, in digital, in a whole bunch of other areas as well. So this is a structural discussion that is going on as part of what is called the APS Reform Program of Work, but also the APS Review, so the Australian Public Service Review, which handed down its interim report a couple of weeks ago, is looking at how do we go about delivering these whole of economy capabilities in a way that the policy, the delivery and then the sustainment can fit better with more contemporary models.
Thank you. We have 2 other questions and we'll have, unfortunately, to close the session. So maybe we take them in sequence. So if you don't mind, and then you here, okay? And I'm sorry you have to close the
Yes,
session.
good morning. As you know, in a multi-layer federal government such as Australia, United States, Brazil and Mexico, rendering government services to citizens always most of the times requires the engagement of different agencies at different levels that not necessarily are willing to collaborate one to each other. So the question is how DTA is handling that conflicting situations that may, of course, time to time, and is through change management structures, public policies, just a political will. Can you please elaborate a little bit on that? Thank you.
It kind of extends on the question asked earlier when it comes to how do we work across the Commonwealth and the jurisdictions. But I'll use the example of identity again because we've been kind of discussing it as part of responses to other questions. If I think about digital identity and linking it into the New South Wales experience, our intention is to, one, understand the end-to-end experience, and that could be at the federal level, the state and territory level or local level, and it could also include private sector organisations. In the case of identity, there's one approach which we could take, which is all Australians are issued with an identity centrally within government. And so if I think about the US context, the social security number becomes the identifier and everybody must use it. We could go for a more federated approach to managing identity, or we could say actually we're happy for each individual jurisdiction or contributor to a life event journey to manage their own enabling capabilities completely independently. Where we're landing is in the middle, where we're saying actually we need to acknowledge that a lot of work that contributes to the end-to-end outcome is occurring in the states and territories. In the case of identity, and I think about New South Wales, has its digital identity product with a number of million users. rather than us saying, actually, New South Wales, you now need to move to the MyGov ID because that's the Commonwealth identity and that's the way we're going to operate. We're saying, actually, we would like to accredit a number of identity providers against the framework that we've been consulting broadly, the Trusted Digital Identity Framework, if people are interested in following this up. It's up to iteration 3. We've had thousands of items of feedback on that framework since we've been consulting with the community, industry and government. But we're saying, actually, New South Wales, we would like to accredit your identity solution, and we would like that to participate in the ecosystem based on the rules that we set centrally. And so what we would see is an environment where we would have the government, federal government digital identity MyGov ID accredited and available to people. We would have a state government digital identity provider, and there could be multiples. And we're also working through an accreditation process with Australia Post, where their identity solution will be connected into the ecosystem. And practically what that means is a person who has a federal government digital identity MyGov ID could use that to access their driver's licence in New South Wales. And likewise, a person with a New South Wales government ID could use that identity to access their tax return. And so what we're looking for is an overall strategic view of the experience, but federation in implementation which doesn't involve winners or losers.
Thank you very much. For the very last question, if you don't mind, in the front row.
Hi, my name is Yoshi Yamamoto, United Nations New York office. A lot of things, a lot of what you said resonates me, maybe colleagues in general, particularly the common pain points. Most of them are really the same as we are facing. One of them is talking about there is no single source of truth, which is one of the rare truths among ourselves. We all know that this problem. And along with that, one of the 3 priorities, you mentioned trust and transparency. So this is we share this also. This is a very difficult problem in the absence of single source of trust. How can we achieve trust and transparency? This is a constant question we are facing. So I'm curious of your approach, how you try to address this. Any working mechanism you're thinking about. That would be great to hear.
Thank you for the question. It's a very big question, though. How do we maintain the trust of the community? I think we have very good practice in the Australian context when it comes to ensuring that we maintain that social licence. And in all of the key customer-facing initiatives, we are committed to ensuring that consent is part of that process. And in the case, again, extending the digital identity example further, where we have somebody that acquires a digital identity with the Australian government provider, MyGov ID, and we connect that into a process which allows them to acquire a tax file number digitally, we have consent on every step of the way. So somebody uses their digital identity and says, I would like to create a tax file number. We have a checkbox to say, are you prepared to share your information that you have with your identity provider with the ATO for the purposes of creating a tax file number? People can choose not to. All that means is as they move into the tax file number form, none of the information is pre-populated. But practically speaking, it is consent-based, and we focus very heavily on that social licence and maintaining trust through privacy impact assessments. And so we conduct privacy impact assessments that are generally independently completed to ensure that we're maintaining privacy. And Australia, I think, is doing quite well when it comes to the cyber security environment as well, although as with every country, we're needing to increase our level of sophistication when it comes to ensuring that we are staying ahead of the bad guys. So we've got a whole bunch of policy controls that we have and an ongoing conversation with the community to maintain that social licence. Now, what was the second part of your question?
So trust and transparency. In this context, how do you approach trust and transparency? What is a working mechanism to achieve that if we don't have that?
Yep. So there are three primary use cases for government administration, kind of distilling it to kind of three, is kind of that research and policy, which is highly anonymised information that can't be reverse engineered to identify individuals or businesses. And that's used to inform policy design, and there are a set of beliefs that people would have when it comes to the use of that data, but typically it's quite an easy social licence and trust discussion to have in that policy and research context. In the middle we have service delivery, where we look to collaborate and share information to improve service delivery. Most of the Australians we speak with believe that government shares much more information than it currently does. And so part of this is education when it comes to what level of sharing we do, but where we do increase that sharing, that we seek permission to do that where we need to in that service delivery context. And the third area is in relation to national security and compliance. And that is an environment that isn't so heavily based on consent. We don't ask the bad guys if we can share their information to discover where they live. And so that social licence discussion is quite different. So we kind of break it down conceptually into those three buckets, where our focus is, one, maintaining the confidence in the community that we're appropriately administering the information that we use to build policy and do research, and that we seek consent and ensure protections are in place where we improve service delivery. And the compliance and enforcement is a different discussion to be had, but it isn't quite as binary as, are you allowing us to make use of your data, or are you not, because it depends on the context in which you're operating.